Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. We want to take this opportunity to look at a strange case that's occurring in Canada now with a political prisoner that's being sought by France and perhaps other countries. So joining me to talk about the case of Dr. Hassan Diab is Monia Mazigh and Roger Clark. Thanks for joining me, Monia and Roger.
Well, thanks very much for inviting us, and thanks for your interest in Hassan's story. It's a story that is not yet over, so we appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me at your show.
I want to start off, though, with Roger. Roger is the support committee, the organizer, spokesperson for the support committee for Dr. Diab. Could you kind of fill us in on what the situation is? Give us background, even though Rattling the Bars and the Real News have done a number of stories on this case. It's spanning 40 years. So could you kind of like give us an overview and then bring us up to where we are now?
Okay, thanks, Eddie. As you say, this case goes back over 40 years. There was a bomb explosion in Paris. It happened on the 3rd of October, 1980. And there were investigations, of course, that went on, but nothing happened. So for almost 20 years, there was no indication whatsoever that the French police had any leads or any information. And then suddenly in the late 1990s, some secret intelligence reports coming from, we even now don't know exactly where from, but likely from East Germany at the time and perhaps Israel, gave the name Hassan Diab. And so a French journalist came over to Canada a few years later. It's in 2007 now, so years are going by, nothing is happening, and confronts Hassan as he's coming out of a class. He was teaching university here in Ottawa, and said, do you know the police are looking for you? You're suspected of planting a bomb. Well, he didn't know anything about it, of course, and was completely surprised. But a few months later, France actually asked for his extradition, submitted various documents, bits of what they called evidence and so forth, most of which has turned out actually to be wrong or bad or non-existent. But nevertheless, Hassan was arrested by the Canadian police and was put in detention for several months and then was put out on bail. And I'll just say this very quickly, but he was on bail under ridiculous conditions. He was being followed. He lost his teaching job after some protests from various groups within Canada. And he was obliged to wear a bracelet, an electronic bracelet, which he wore day in, day out, and he had to pay for that himself. He had to pay 2,000 Canadian dollars a month. It's a small detail, but it shows the sort of degree of harassment. The extradition process lasted quite a long time, from 2008, 2009, right up to 2014, when Hassan was extradited to Paris very quickly and hastily. I won't go into the details, but basically he couldn't even say goodbye to his family. He was then put in prison in France. We're talking about November 2014. And he stayed in prison, mostly in solitary confinement, for over 3 years. Now, the important thing about all of that is that when people are extradited, they're extradited to face charges. In this case, there were no charges laid. In fact, the 3 and a bit years that Hassan spent in prison, all of that time, the French continued their investigations into his case. They followed one lead after another. Some of the judges recommended that he be freed on bail. The prosecution overturned that. And then after just over 3 years, 2 very good investigators, and I have to give them credit because they looked into everything. They traveled to Lebanon. They found evidence that Hassan, in fact, was in Lebanon at the time of the 1980 bombing. So there was very strong alibi evidence. And there was a lot more handwriting evidence that was produced to justify his extradition, but in fact turned out to be wrong. The experts made a mistake and they were criticized very heavily. So on the basis of all of that, in January of 2018, Hassan was actually freed and returned to Canada. We were hoping that that was the end of the story. Unfortunately, it's not. It got worse. The French prosecutor appealed Hassan's release and, in fact, demanded that he face trial. And that was also in 2018. That process has gone on for another 2 years, and the appeal court, in fact, sent Hassan to trial. Hassan appealed against that, and last week, the Supreme Court in Paris, the Cour de Cassation, actually denied Hassan's appeal, basically upholding the lower court, which has sent, will send Hassan to trial and maybe face extradition one more time, a process which may go on for a year or two, but that's where we are right now.
Okay, all right. Monia, I understand that you kind of personally experienced something similar to this with your husband, and not to take away from Dr. Diab's case, but give me a little background, what happened to your husband, and then how you find yourself involved in this case, if you will.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for Real News for inviting me and Rogers to the show. Yeah, very briefly, I think it's very important to reframe this conversation that we are having into the ongoing war on terror and into the, I would say, international, quite very much mainstream Islamophobia that we are still living in it in different countries, whether it is in France, whether Canada, or in the United States. So I think it's very important for the listeners or people who watch this program to keep in mind these two important sort of lines. Yes, in 2002, my husband, Meher Arar, who is a Canadian citizen, born originally from Syria, so he was born in Damascus, but came in 1988 to Canada and lived since in Canada. He was arrested by the American authorities on his way from Tunisia, where I am originally from, where I was at that time with both of my kids. And he was arrested on a stopover at the JFK Kennedy Airport and arrested by the FBI. And since I kind of lost contact with him, I didn't know. I was waiting for him to call me from Canada because that was his supposed to be last destination. This was September 2002, 1 year after 9/11, and all the new procedure of fingerprinting, stopping, profiling people from certain countries were in place for the first time, actually, after the 9/11 attacks. And my husband found himself thrown into this new era, post-era of 9/11, and he was put in detention, incommunicado, so in solitary confinement, into the Metropolitan Detention Center in New York. I couldn't contact him. He couldn't contact me. He was strip searched. He was blindfolded. And after a few weeks from that, he was put in a plane and deported to, unwillingly, actually, they tried so hard, the American authorities, to let him sign on a deportation paper. and he found himself in Jordan. From there, he was taken to Syria. So all this, of course, I knew it later on. All these details were, for me, unknown. All I knew at that time was that he disappeared. The Canadian government did very, very little at the beginning, quite frankly, I mean, until the end, because all they kept saying, he's a Syrian citizen, he's in Syria, there is not really much we can do right now. So thanks to organization, a human rights organization, activists, some dedicated journalists, I was able to raise the case into the Canadian media, into the Canadian public, and I asked constantly for the repatriation and the return of my husband, who has not, like in the case of Hassan Diab, never charged with any crime. They kept saying that he is a suspected terrorist, he is associated with Al-Qaeda. There were no evidence, there were no formal charges. Of course, in Syria, he was tortured, he was kept underground in a detention center. And thanks to all the work that we were able to do in Canada, the Canadian politicians were able to work and put some pressure and ask the Syrian to release him, and then he was able to come to Canada. So, I mean, unfortunately for Dr. Diab, of course, things are still going on after his return. And I think the stakes are even here higher. Maybe we can talk about that later on. But it is, again, as I said at the very beginning, this is a continuation of, even if they don't say it or they don't explicitly, keep telling it, this is a continuation of the war on terror. This is the continuation of those anti-terrorist legislation. And of course, in France, it's a very, very special, specific situation where the government is, without explicitly saying it, targeting it majority sort of community of Muslim French with different laws. So all this is not at all helping Dr. Diab in his seek for justice.
Roger, can you tell me, because I understand the first time they extradited him was without any evidence of a trial or any valid proof. I thought that was against the law in Canada. What's the law about extraditing Canadian citizens to another country?
Well, there are a couple of points. One is that the Canadian Extradition Act is very defective. One of the reasons that Hassan was extradited to France brought to light a lot of the failings of the Extradition Act itself. And you're right in that really there is no protection such as one would expect from a court of law. Witnesses cannot be called, evidence cannot be challenged. And a lot of lawyers in Canada would say that it's sufficient for a foreign country to send a very brief file of accusation, and that this will be sufficient in order to obtain the extradition of that individual. And that's one thing that we've seen. But I'd like to also add to what Monia has just said, a very important point, and that is the sort of social, cultural, political mood around what is going on and what was going on even then. I mean, we're talking even in the 1980s, terrorist attacks and so on were occurring in various parts of Europe, and this has continued. And not to say that we shouldn't be taking those seriously, of course we have to. It's very important. But at the same time, it's created a mood of suspicion, a circumstance where people can be investigated, but evidence not brought forward to justify trial. In France right now, in addition to a very strong mood of Islamophobia, there's also a shift to what would be called the political right. The Macron and others are afraid of people like Marine Le Pen. And so there is a shift towards a hard line, law and order, reinforce the police activities. All of these things are going on right now in France, and Hassan falls into the middle of some of that. I mean, the real question, and Eddie, you were sort of hinting at this earlier, there is no evidence. Certainly at the time, the French tried to produce handwriting evidence. They brought in experts. It turns out after many years that the experts themselves were faulty. What they swore was in fact true was not true. And the Court of Appeal that in January of this year said that Hassan must go to trial was in fact using wrong evidence, non-existent evidence, was making up things. And all of that we know because it came out in the report from the investigative judges who set him free. The alibi is a very big point. Hassan maintained from the beginning that he was actually in Beirut in October of 1980. He was a university student in his early 20s. He was writing his exams. So one of the investigating judges actually traveled to Lebanon, was able to interview students who were there at the same time as Hassan, who confirmed that he was in fact there, was able to obtain documents from Beirut University showing that Hassan was in fact taking his exams. So the alibi evidence itself, which in most courts would be more than sufficient to show the innocence of the individual, has been set aside. And so we go on. So I think the question of why is he being pursued in the light of all of this? What is this judicial nightmare that is haunting him and which seems to now have no end? And why are the French courts playing this sort of game? Even senior prosecution assistants, the Avocat Général, advised the appeal court to uphold Hassan's appeal, but they didn't. They ignored it. So we have to ask, what really is going on? There is no evidence, not a scrap of evidence, to show that he is guilty. There is a lot of evidence that shows he is innocent. So that's the question.
Okay, this decision came down from the French court. They are calling for the extradition. Where are we now? Where is Dr. Diab now in terms of what's the next steps?
Okay, well, it certainly has gone back down to the appeal court, and the appeal court is the one who will now make a second decision. Having first found him guilty and sending him to trial, will reaffirm that. I suspect there may well be then a decision in the next days or weeks setting a trial date for Hassan. Clearly, Hassan will not return to France for that trial. If there is a trial, there is absolutely no reason for him to do that. Such a trial, given the history of what we've seen in the French system, would be really a farce and would be one more step in finding this scapegoat that they so desperately seem to want to find. But let's say that a trial is ordered. The trial could take place even with Hassan remaining in Canada. So in absentia would be a typical outcome. The fact that he's not there would probably play against him. And so we can anticipate that if there is a trial, Hassan will be found guilty. And there could be another request for his extradition made to Canada in order not this time to investigate, but for him to serve a prison sentence. And this is what we're very afraid of. If we trusted the system, if we trusted the Canadians to do the right thing, if we believed that the French system was honorable and legitimate, then we would say, yeah, fine, let things take their course. But it's not. But all the more so that we know that Hassan is innocent. And the most disturbing thing that I've seen recently in the French media was a remark by one of the groups that's been pushing for his conviction. The remark was, well, if Hassan is so innocent, why doesn't he come back and face trial? I mean, it's the most ludicrous argument that you can imagine being made, but it shows the desperation of those groups who are so determined to find somebody, no matter who. The victims deserve justice. We've said that from the very beginning. The 46 people that were injured in the bomb attack, the families of the 4 people who were killed, they all deserve justice. Of course they do. But they do not get justice through the conviction of an innocent man. And that's the bottom line right now. So it's important to remember that Prime Minister Trudeau himself has said that everything must be done to protect Hassan Diab, Canadian citizen. And after Hassan's return from France in early 2018, Prime Minister Trudeau was asked publicly to comment on Hassan's case. And what he said on the 20th of June, 2018, is the following.
I think for Hassan Diab, we have to recognize, first of all, that what happened to him never should have happened. This is something that obviously was an extremely difficult situation to go through for himself, for his family, and that's why we've asked for an independent external review to look into exactly how this happened and make sure that it never happens again.
And that is really what we are going to hold the Prime Minister to right now.
Okay, Mona, can you kind of share with us what you think at this stage of the game the public can be doing that would have would maybe convince Canada not to go along with this, or just in general, because there's children, there's a wife, there's family, there's all kinds of stuff, and I'm sure this is also depressing for Dr. Diab itself. What should the public be doing? What can they do to kind of like give support at this stage of the game?
Very, very important that this case wouldn't really fall off the radar of the public. I think it is incredible what Rogers and the support committee has been doing to keep this case alive, to ask very important, calls from the Canadian public to, first of all, keep following the case, but also keep the Canadian government accountable. So I think one of the most important and easy and obvious step is to write to the Prime Minister Trudeau today to ask him to put a stop to this, what Roger called a farce, because this is ongoing. He's going to be judge abstentia, and then he's going to look as if he's hiding, and who knows what would happen after. Maybe he will lose again his job. So I think this is really an ongoing, and somehow this matter should be stopped, and Canada has a role. It's not about interference. It is about the protection of one of its own citizen, the right of its own citizen. This is not interference. When Canada talk with the Chinese government about the release of the 2 Michaels. We have 2 Canadians who are detained over there. They are not interfering with the Chinese government. They are calling for the protection of the rights of their own citizens. So I think Hassan Diab really deserved the same sort of, let's call it interference, or the same sort of treatment, in protecting his right. And right now, his rights as a citizen has not been protected. He has been extradited, despite the flimsy, despite the very, shaky evidence, and then he was imprisoned for almost 4 years in France. There was a judge who considered this case as kind of done, and he really asked for his release, but then we are still on and on and on with this case. So I think this is a drain physically, emotionally on Hassan himself, on his family and friends. So this should be stopped. And the role of the Canadian public, and I remember myself, I was no longer talking with the government, I was talking with the Canadian public. And I think this is very important. The Canadian public are smart. If they are really told the facts and the truth, they are going to ask for the right thing to be done. And I'm sure here, whether it is a campaign of letters, whether it is, a hashtag in the social media, whether it is protest in front of the office of the Prime Minister office, I think those are important acts to keep the case alive, but also to keep the demands of having Hassan Diab rights protected. And this sort of, I call it, I wrote about the case and I call it legal vendetta. I think this is a really, really legal vendetta because, there is a difference between pursuing justice, and there is a difference between finding someone and trying to put him in prison no matter at any cost. And Hassan Diab, using the evidence, using legal evidence, has been once again found that he is innocent. So why this persistence of trying to indict him, trying to put him? So I think keep the public informed. This case should be really, again, in the minds and in the radar of a lot of journalists and public, also Canadian public, and asking the decision maker, political, like our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, to stand up with one of his citizen rights. Hassan Diab deserves no less than that.
Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to follow this, and if there's any new developments, reach out to us so we can follow up and stay on top of it. So right now, Mona and Roger, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eddie.
And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.